The sun shone obligingly upon the village of St. Mildred's that June afternoon, as though it too had received a formal invitation to the garden party at Rosewood Hall. The lawns were immaculate, the tea tables delicately laid, and the scent of roses and lavender drifted lazily through the air. Beneath the great elms that bordered the lawn, ladies in wide-brimmed hats fluttered like butterflies, their laughter mingling with the strains of a string quartet positioned discreetly near the orangery. Lady Caroline Whitby, the hostess, surveyed her guests with the air of one who took great pride in both her social influence and her hydrangeas. Rosewood Hall was her ancestral home, a sprawling Georgian estate that dominated the western end of the village, a place both admired and whispered about in equal measure. Miss Jane Marple, a quiet figure in pale blue muslin, sat at one of the side tables, her knitting needles clicking softly as she conversed with the vicar's wife. Her eyes, mild and unassuming, drifted occasionally toward the assembled crowd. It was an old habit, her way of observing without appearing to do so. She noticed how Mrs. Lydia Ferris, the doctor's wife, avoided the gaze of her neighbor, how young Peter Latham, the estate gardener, poured himself another cup of punch with a hand that trembled slightly, how Lady Caroline's nephew, Mr. Basil Whitby, was far too attentive to the pretty school teacher, Miss Evans. All perfectly ordinary village life, except, as Miss Marple often said, it was precisely in ordinary settings that the most extraordinary things occurred. The occasion was meant to celebrate the engagement of Miss Clara Whitby, Lady Caroline's only daughter, to Mr. Harold Denham, a solicitor from London. The couple smiled dutifully as congratulations poured in, though Miss Marple detected the faintest stiffness in their shared glances. Love, she thought, ought to be warmer than that. It was just after 4 o'clock when the tranquility of the afternoon shattered. A scream, high, sharp, and utterly incongruous with the gentle murmur of conversation, cut through the music. The string quartet faltered, and teacups froze mid-air. From behind the clipped yew hedge near the lake came the sound of running footsteps, and then another cry, lower, strangled. Within moments, Peter Latham burst into view, his face white as linen. "Lady Caroline, come quickly. It's Mr. Denham. He's dead." The crowd surged as one, gasps rising like the rustle of startled birds. Lady Caroline's fan slipped from her hand, fluttering to the grass. Miss Marple set down her knitting very gently, her eyes narrowing, not in shock, but in quiet recognition. It had begun. "I'm happy to continue, but I can't write in Agatha Christie's exact style. I'll keep the same characters, tone, and cozy yet deadly village mystery vibe you asked for. Prim observational wit, layered suspects, and psychological clues, without echoing any one author's phrasing." The scream seemed to hang about the yew hedge long after the sound itself had died. People drifted toward the lake in little hesitant clusters, held back by propriety and drawn on by curiosity. Lady Caroline gathered herself with surprising efficiency, issuing gentle commands that sounded very much like orders. "No crowding, please. Dr. Ferris, if you would. Basil, fetch a rug. No, from the morning room, the green one. Clara, darling, sit down at once." Clara had not moved. She stood as though the lawn had become a tilted deck and she must brace herself against the fall of it. Her fiancé lay beyond the hedge, half on the gravel path and half on the crushed thyme that edged it, his eyes closed and his complexion an unlovely grey. His tie was slightly askew, which gave his immaculate appearance a curious intimacy, like a man suddenly embarrassed in public. Dr. Ferris arrived with a certain solemn bustle, which reassured no one. He knelt, fingers at the throat, eyes at the pupils, an economical press of the chest that altered nothing. "I'm afraid," he began, but the rest was unnecessary. He asked after the police, and someone had already gone to ring Inspector Harrow at the station. Miss Marple, who had been among the last to move, arrived in time to see the arrangement of the scene before it altered with kindness and blankets. She did not push. She rarely needed to. The little gaps in a crowd seemed to make room for a small, elderly woman without anybody noticing. She looked not at the face of the poor young man, but at his hands, one palm open against the gravel, the other lightly curved, as though he had meant to take hold of something and been prevented. There was the faintest smear upon the inner wrist, not dirt, not sap, something pale that caught the light. She also noticed a dark, damp mark on the right cuff, despite the day being dry for a fortnight. On the path near his shoulder lay 2 crushed petals of white rose and, a little farther off, the smallest pearl button scuffed on one edge. "Heart," Mrs. Potts from the post office announced grimly to Mrs. Ellery, because Mrs. Potts believed that firm pronouncements prevented fainting. All these modern men, too much London and not enough porridge. "It might have been the heat," breathed Miss Evans, the school teacher, who realized even as she spoke that the sky was not especially hot, and she had made a foolish remark. She colored and clasped her hands tighter. Peter Latham hovered behind the hedge, looking as though he would be sent for a caning. "I only went round to fetch the spare trestles," he muttered to nobody in particular. "Mr. Denham, he was making a sound like he couldn't get his breath. I ran for help." "And what were you doing near the lake before that?" asked Basil Whitby, whose tone had the brittle courage of a man eager to be useful. "You were there 10 minutes ago. I saw you go down with a basket." "Cutting sweet peas for the table, sir," Peter said, a flush rising. "Mrs. Cornwall asked me." Mrs. Cornwall, the housekeeper, confirmed it at once, loud with the righteousness of a woman who runs a large house efficiently. "I did so. If the flowers are to be viewed, someone must fetch them." Dr. Ferris rose and addressed Lady Caroline. "We must move him in, out of sight. The inspector will want the general account, but I doubt we shall disturb anything essential by showing respect." "Of course," Lady Caroline said. In the saying she recovered all her authority. Men came with the green rug which laid over Harold Denham transformed him from a person into a solemn shape. The quartet, not knowing whether to stop or soldier on, faltered into silence. Somewhere in the shrubs a blackbird, oblivious, went on with his business in bright staccato notes. In the absence of music, the village did what villages have always done. It began to speak, not loudly, but with enormous vigor and precision. "Such a pity for Clara," sighed Mrs. Ellery. "One hears things about London solicitors, fast friends and faster habits." "Clara is no fool," returned Mrs. Potts, which carried both sympathy and a certain censure, appropriately balanced. "Though I did think they were a little chilly for engaged persons." "Perhaps they had words," suggested Mr. Pritchard, who looked after the church roof and, for that reason, took a gloomy interest in sudden tragedy. "There was a telegram from Mr. Denham at the post office this morning. Miss Clara signed for it." "How romantic," said Miss Evans, and then regretted it. "Nothing of the sort," Mrs. Potts said. "Urgent business is never romantic." From the servants' side of the lawn there came a different stream, practical, detailed, and with the exactness that arises from long training in noticing who went where and when. The second footman, Tom, had seen Mr. Denham and Mr. Basil near the yews shortly before 4. The maid with the teacups remembered Mr. Denham had declined the trifle and asked for plain sponge, which she considered very nearly a criticism. The gardener's boy swore that a stranger, thin, grey suit, hat pulled low, had come up the drive and stood by the gate a minute and then gone away. "Did he come in?" Mrs. Cornwall demanded. The boy was firm. In, no, but listening, yes. He had the surety of boys who have spied from hedges all their short lives. Miss Marple filed the stranger with the hat beside the pearl button and the damp cuff, which together did not yet form a picture. She had a small memory of grey suits and gates from another village, another summer. But one mustn't be greedy with parallels, she told herself. People do madly original things for the most repetitive reasons. Clara sat at last, persuaded by the vicar's wife, into a chair on the terrace. She did not weep, which made several ladies uneasy. She spoke very little, which made several men respectful. When Miss Marple approached, it was ostensibly to ask after a misplaced shawl. A white lawn with a rather old-fashioned border. I'm forever leaving things about. Clara turned toward her with a quick, polite attention that in happier times might have been warmth. I haven't seen it, Miss Marple. But perhaps in the orangery. The chairs there catch at delicate fabrics. Indeed they do, Miss Marple said. Forgive me, my dear. I dislike to intrude at such a moment, only I fancied Mr. Denham's cuff was a trifle damp, and I wondered whether he had gone near the water earlier. Men will wander off at parties as if lakes had their own invitation cards. Clara's gaze flinched, almost imperceptibly. He detested boating. He preferred order. She clasped her hands again. I didn't see him go to the lake. He and I, had a small difference about the guest list. It was nothing. Of course, Miss Marple said softly, and stooped to fuss with the chair leg, which was behaving perfectly well. When she straightened, she saw Mrs. Lydia Ferris watching her. Mrs. Ferris's eyes were anxious, but not in the direction one might expect. The doctor's wife looked toward her husband, then toward Lady Caroline, as if between those two lay some line that should not be crossed. Inspector Harrow arrived with a constable and a notebook that ought, by tradition, to resolve everything and rarely did. He had a manner both respectful and faintly exasperated with society, at its most decorative. After a few measured questions, who had first found the deceased, who had been nearest the yew hedge, he allowed the guest to drift back to the lawn, though the mood had shifted into a careful hush. The obvious answer presented itself as obvious answers will. Peter Latham had found the body. He had been near the lake. His hands were not clean. His wages relied on the goodwill of a household Mr. Denham was said to be advising on certain economies. Land sales, Mr. Pritchard murmured to those who would listen. Always the beginning of the end. Basil confirmed, a shade too promptly, that Denham had recommended practical measures. Peter's chin came up in wounded pride. He said nothing further, which did not help him in the eyes of people for whom silence is an admission. Miss Marple, seated once more with her knitting, thought that silence could mean many things: dignity, fear, anger, even love. What it did not mean, in her experience, was simplicity. As the green rug passed through the French doors toward the cool dimness of the morning room, a little draught lifted the corner. For an instant, Miss Marple saw again the open palm, the slight curve of the other hand, and the scuffed pearl button that a footman now, with the blinking conscientiousness of youth, stooped to pocket as litter. She made a mental note about buttons and who wore them, and which hems bristled with thread ends, from a quick repair before a party. A faint commotion arose at the drive. The thin man in grey, if he had ever been there, was not there now. But the gatekeeper, Saunders, stood speaking earnestly to Inspector Harrow, and Harrow turned a narrow eye toward the guests. It was a measuring look, the kind one gives a shelf of familiar jars when one has mislaid the correct label. Tea was offered and refused, then offered again. Nobody left. Guilt, innocence, grief, and curiosity kept their awkward truce upon the lawn. The roses went on smelling of roses, and Miss Marple, with the habit of a lifetime, counted silently backward from what must have happened to what could have made it so. There was already, in the imbalance of a chair, the damp of a cuff, the timid gesture Clara had not managed to complete, more shape than most people would have credited. Not a picture yet, but, like a pattern in old crochet, it would come through if one did not tug at it too hard. By evening, the village had wrapped the event in its usual fabric of rumour and reassurance. The ladies of St. Mildred's told themselves the poor man had died suddenly, that it was merciful, that such things happened to city men who never learned to rest properly. Yet beneath the sympathy, threads of speculation wound tighter. The police had taken statements and gone, the body removed to the undertaker's in town, and still no one quite believed that life at Rosewood Hall could resume its rhythm. Miss Marple walked home slowly through lanes washed with the pale gold of dusk. Her small cottage, tucked behind the church, was neat as ever, but her mind was still in the garden by the lake. Death, in her experience, seldom entered without reason. She brewed a pot of tea and sat with her notebook, a modest thing meant for household accounts, and jotted names, times, impressions. She did not write suspects. It sounded so disagreeable. But she wrote Basil, too quick to accuse. Lydia Ferris, nervous eyes? Clara, shock without tears. Peter Latham, fear or guilt? Pearl button, white, found near body. Whose garment? A knock interrupted her thoughts. It was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Weatherby, carrying a basket of scones and an air of suppressed importance. "I thought you might like a bite, dear. One can't imagine cooking after such a day." Miss Marple thanked her and poured a cup. "I suppose the whole village is talking?" "My dear, they're positively beside themselves. Some think it was poison, though how I can't say. Others claim the poor man had enemies in London. Lydia Ferris told me he was advising Lady Caroline to sell part of the estate. It's dreadful, isn't it?" "Dreadful indeed," said Miss Marple. Advising the sale of land always stirs feelings. People grow oddly attached to fields they never walk upon. Mrs. Weatherby nodded, as though this explained everything. "I just hope they don't suspect that poor gardener. Such a nice young man, though he did look terribly pale." "Fear," Miss Marple murmured, "or conscience, difficult to tell without a better light." The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of morning that insists on normality whether one wishes it or not. Yet the village square buzzed like a disturbed hive. The paper boy shouted news that hadn't yet reached print, and shopkeepers leaned across counters with the gravity of statesmen. Inspector Harrow arrived from the station by bicycle, coat flapping, notebook at the ready. He was met by Lady Caroline herself, who had summoned him to the hall. The inspector respected her composure but distrusted her certainty. People who believed their world was orderly often failed to notice the chaos beneath. Miss Marple, having been invited to take tea with Lady Caroline, an honor bestowed on account of that dreadful shock you had, Miss Marple, being so near the scene, found herself once again at Rosewood Hall. The grand room seemed quieter now, the corridors heavy with the hush of a house that listens. Clara was upstairs resting. Basil had gone into the village on errands of importance no one had defined, and Mrs. Cornwall presided over the tea tray with martial efficiency. Lady Caroline, porcelain cup steady in her gloved hand, spoke with careful precision. "The inspector believes it may have been the heart after all. Harold was not a strong man. Of course, there must be an inquiry, but surely it was natural." "Of course," Miss Marple said gently, "though I did wonder about the damp mark on his cuff. The day was so dry." Lady Caroline's hand paused midway to her lips. "A trifle, surely. He may have spilled his drink." "Quite possibly." Miss Marple's voice was mild. "Only the mark was not of punch. It had no color. More like water, perhaps, or the residue of something recently washed." The older woman's composure wavered, just for a moment, before she smiled. "You are observant, Miss Marple. How fortunate for us all." Later, when Miss Marple made her way out through the side garden, she caught sight of Mrs. Ferris lingering by the gate. Lydia's face was drawn, her eyes flicking nervously toward the house. "Good morning, Mrs. Ferris," Miss Marple said, pausing. "A sad business, is it not?" "Terrible," Lydia murmured. "I can hardly think of anything else." "You knew Mr. Denham fairly well, I gather." The woman hesitated. "Only through my husband, of course. Harold consulted him about something medical, I believe." "Medical?" Miss Marple's brows lifted a fraction. "Then his heart complaint was known?" Lydia faltered. "I don't think it was serious. Dr. Ferris never mentioned— I shouldn't speak of it." She looked around quickly, lowering her voice. "It's only that Harold was troubled lately." There was someone from London, a man who came twice. I saw him from our window last week, a thin man in grey." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inside a familiar pattern began to weave itself. "Indeed. How very interesting. Did your husband see him?" "I believe he did," she said, twisting her gloves. "He went out after him, but when he returned, he said it was nothing. Only a messenger, he claimed. Yet he looked strained." "Thank you, my dear," said Miss Marple softly. "Sometimes it's the things we think nothing of that turn out most important." When she reached the lane again, she met Peter Latham trudging back from the police station. His cap was in his hands, and his eyes were red. "They think I did something, Miss Marple," he blurted. "Inspector asked about the quarrel last week, but I never meant no harm. Mr. Denham said I'd be let go when they sold the South Meadow. I just said it weren't fair, that's all." "Anger doesn't make a murderer, Peter," she said kindly. "But tell me, when you found him, did you notice anything odd besides the way he lay?" The boy frowned, recalling. "There was a smell, ma'am. Not flowers, nor anything from the kitchen. Sharp, like polish or spirits. And a bit of glass by the path, I think, from a little bottle." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "And did you mention that to the inspector?" He shook his head. "Didn't think it mattered." "It nearly always does," she said. That evening the vicar stopped by her gate. "You've heard, of course," he said, lowering his voice. "The inspector's not satisfied. There were traces of something in Mr. Denham's glass. A tonic of sorts. They've sent it to the lab in town." Miss Marple looked toward the churchyard, where the last light lay upon the stones. "Poison, then, not heart. How very sad, and yet not surprising, don't you think? Some people die of what they are given, others of what they give away." The vicar looked puzzled, but she smiled gently, turning the conversation to roses. Still, when he had gone, she returned to her little notebook and added a line beneath pearl button. "Polish smell, glass shard, tonic bottle. Who poured?" Outside, the evening breeze stirred the leaves. Somewhere in the village, a gate creaked softly, and footsteps passed on the road. Miss Marple sat motionless in her chair, listening. She had the distinct feeling that the killer was not far away, still watching the ripples of their own handiwork fade upon the calm surface of St. Mildred's. And she knew, with that quiet certainty born of long acquaintance with human folly, that the calm would not last. The next day brought rain, a steady, whispering drizzle that soaked into the thatch and blurred the lines of the hedgerows. It seemed almost indecently appropriate, Miss Marple thought, for the village to look so subdued. Death, especially when it involved scandal, had a way of turning weather poetic. From her window she could see the narrow street below, shining like slate. A constable pedalled past on his bicycle, the splash of his tires muffled by the mist. Somewhere a clock struck 10. Miss Marple put aside her knitting, buttoned her coat, and set out for the village post office. Errands, after all, were as good a reason as any to hear what people were saying. Inside, the air smelled of damp paper and lavender polish. Mrs. Potts was sorting letters with exaggerated solemnity, clearly relishing her new role as keeper of secrets. "You've heard, I suppose, Miss Marple," she began before being asked. "The inspector came back last night from the laboratory in Kingsmere. They found traces of something, strychnine, they say, in Mr. Denham's glass. Imagine, poison, right here in St. Mildred's." "Dear me," said Miss Marple. "How very unpleasant." Mrs. Potts lowered her voice, though no one else was in the shop. "And they've been asking about who served the drinks. It seems that poor Peter carried the tray." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple murmured. "But surely the glasses came from the house, not the garden." Mrs. Potts beamed at the chance to elaborate. "Oh, indeed. Mrs. Cornwall says the tray was filled in the orangery. That's where they were pouring the punch. Miss Evans was helping, wasn't she? Such a nice girl, though, perhaps a bit, well, eager." Eager, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. In what sense? Mrs. Potts leaned forward conspiratorially. You know how young ladies can be when there's a handsome man about. I saw her talking to Mr. Denham at the fete last week. Quite an animated conversation. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It's often surprising, my dear, how animated young people can be when they think no one notices. She made her purchases, stamps, a spool of thread, and stepped back into the damp air. The rain had softened to a mist, curling around her umbrella like breath. She walked slowly toward the schoolhouse, where the faint sound of a piano reached her ears. Inside, Miss Evans sat alone at the upright piano, her fingers moving through a hesitant melody. She started when she saw Miss Marple. "Oh, you frightened me." "My apologies, my dear," said Miss Marple, taking a seat in one of the small wooden chairs. "I only wanted to return a handkerchief I found. It was on the table near where the drinks were served." Miss Evans took it, eyes widening slightly. "Oh, thank you. I thought I'd lost it. I was helping with the glasses, you see, just before." She trailed off. "Yes, I understand," said Miss Marple. "It was kind of you to assist. Lady Caroline must have been grateful." The young woman hesitated. She didn't really ask. It was Basil, actually. He said they were short-handed and that the servants were busy. I suppose I wanted to be useful. "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "Mr. Basil seems a very persuasive young man." Miss Evans flushed. He's charming. But I think he disliked Mr. Denham. They had words once, something about Clara." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "That does complicate matters." She rose, her hands folded neatly on her umbrella handle. "You'll forgive an old woman's curiosity, my dear, but do you recall whether Mr. Denham drank much of his punch?" Miss Evans shook her head. "Hardly any. He seemed distracted. I remember because he asked for a glass, took a sip, then left it on the table. I meant to fetch it later, but there were so many guests." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "You've been most helpful. Such little recollections often matter more than they seem." When she left the schoolhouse, the rain had ceased, leaving the road slick and gleaming. A carriage was drawn up outside the doctor's house, and Miss Marple, who never hurried, adjusted her pace so she arrived just as Mrs. Ferris stepped out. Lydia looked pale, her face drawn tighter than ever. "Miss Marple," she said, forcing a smile, "how are you managing today?" "Quite well, thank you," said Miss Marple. "And you, my dear? You seem worried." "Oh, it's nothing," Lydia replied too quickly. "Dr. Ferris has been called to the hall again. The inspector asked him to confirm certain medical points about the poison." "How very thorough," Miss Marple said. "I do admire diligence. Did your husband ever mention whether Mr. Denham was taking medicine of any kind?" Lydia bit her lip. "Only a tonic, I think. Something he brought from London. My husband examined the bottle. Said it was harmless enough." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet strychnine is rather easy to mistake for quinine if one isn't careful. I've known cases where well-meaning people made dreadful errors." Lydia's hands twisted together. "You don't think? Surely not Harold himself?" "Oh, no, my dear," Miss Marple said soothingly. "Only that sometimes what looks like intent begins with carelessness. Still, one can't always separate the two once the deed is done." She left Lydia standing uncertainly by the carriage and continued home. There was much to consider. The poisoned glass, the quarrel between Basil and Denham, Clara's coolness, and the stranger in grey. Each thread knotted somewhere she could not yet see. That evening, as she sat by her hearth, a soft tap came at her door. It was Inspector Harrow, hat dripping, expression weary. "I hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple," he said. "You seem to have a gift for noticing things I don't." "Noticing is only practice, Inspector." "Tea," he accepted gratefully, perching on the edge of a chair. "We've learned something new." The bottle found by the path, small, clear glass. It contained the residue of strychnine. No label, and there were fingerprints, but too smudged to match. It might have been dropped during the party. "Interesting," Miss Marple said. "Was the cork still in it?" "It was," he replied, though loosely. "You think that matters?" "Perhaps." "Cork replaced in haste can tell one a great deal about conscience." She paused. "And what of Mr. Basil Whitby?" The inspector's eyes narrowed slightly. "You've thought of him too, have you? He was seen arguing with Denham the morning of the party. Something about the sale of the South Meadow. But I've nothing solid yet." Miss Marple nodded, pouring more tea. "He is quick-tempered, but passion, though noisy, seldom plots. Poison belongs to quieter tempers." Harrow studied her with reluctant admiration. "You think it was planned, then?" "I think," she said softly, "that someone feared what Mr. Denham might reveal. And when fear meets opportunity, plans come very quickly." Outside, the rain began again, pattering against the window. The inspector rose, thanking her. When he left, Miss Marple sat still for a long while, the teapot cooling beside her. She could almost feel the pattern tightening, each thread drawn a little nearer to its conclusion. She thought of the pearl button again, of the scent of polish Peter had noticed, of the missing label on the bottle, and she thought, too, of Clara Whitby's composure. So calm, so deliberate. Grief came in many guises, and sometimes the quietest face concealed the deepest fear. When she finally extinguished the lamp and went to her room, the village lay silent beneath the mist. Yet Miss Marple, who understood the ways of human conscience better than most, felt certain that someone else in St. Mildred's was still awake, watching the darkness, waiting to see whether their secret would hold until morning. Morning brought a tentative brightness, the kind that seems uncertain whether to bless or betray. The storm had passed, leaving the hedgerows sparkling with rain and the air clean enough to reveal the faint tang of river water drifting from the meadows. St. Mildred's looked peaceful again, though the peace felt false, like a curtain drawn over an untidy room. Miss Marple walked to the churchyard after breakfast, carrying a small posy of sweet peas. It was not for Mr. Denham, his funeral was still days away, but for the vicar's wife, who had once confided that flowers at graves cheered the living more than the dead. Miss Marple found that sentiment perfectly true. She laid the flowers carefully on the Weatherby's plot, then stood for a moment, looking toward Rosewood Hall in the distance. Even from here, its pale stone facade glowed faintly through the trees, dignified and aloof, as though indifferent to the turmoil it harbored. The sound of footsteps made her turn. Inspector Harrow was approaching, his hands in his pockets, his expression set in the look of a man both puzzled and intrigued. "Good morning, Miss Marple. You seem to make a habit of being where I mean to go." She smiled. "It's a small village, Inspector. Our paths must meet somewhere." He joined her beside the grave. "I've just come from the hall. Lady Caroline's beside. Herself, the newspapers have got hold of the story. They're hinting at scandal. She wants the matter closed, quickly if possible." "I imagine she does," said Miss Marple mildly. "But truth is rather like smoke, isn't it? It has a way of seeping through the smallest cracks." Harrow gave a short laugh. "You'd make a fine detective, Miss Marple. You see patterns where I see only fog." "Fog conceals patterns, Inspector. It doesn't erase them." She tilted her head slightly. "Have you learned anything new?" He sighed. "Not much. Dr. Ferris insists the poison wasn't administered long before death. An hour at most. That puts the fatal drink squarely at the garden party. Basil Whitby's alibi is that he was arranging music near the orangery when Denham collapsed. Miss Evans confirms she saw him there. Peter Latham still under suspicion, though I'm not convinced. And Clara—" He paused. "Clara barely speaks. It's grief, perhaps, but it feels guarded." "Guarded," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I've noticed that too. Sometimes people protect their grief for fear of what it might reveal." They walked together toward the gate, where the lane curved past the church. Harrow hesitated. "You've known Lady Caroline for years. Was there ever any scandal attached to her family?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not scandal, Inspector, at least not the kind one finds in the papers. But there was once an incident, long before Clara's birth. A guest at Rosewood Hall who overstayed his welcome, a man of rather dubious charm. He vanished quite suddenly. There was talk of debts, nothing more. Yet I've always thought Lady Caroline never quite forgave the world for that embarrassment." Harrow raised an eyebrow. "You think there's a connection?" "Oh, not directly," she said lightly. "But such things have a way of lingering in families. They teach lessons about discretion, about what must never be spoken of." The inspector nodded slowly, thoughtful. "Well, I'll keep that in mind. There's to be a small inquest tomorrow. You'll attend?" "If I'm permitted," she said. "I've always found human nature most revealing under oath." That evening, Rosewood Hall glowed with lamplight, its windows reflecting the last red streaks of sunset. Inside, the atmosphere was brittle with suppressed tension. Clara Whitby sat in the drawing room, embroidery in her lap, though the thread had not moved for several minutes. Her mother stood at the window, speaking in clipped tones to Basil. "It is intolerable," Lady Caroline was saying. "Reporters asking questions as though we were criminals. Harold's death was a tragedy, not a spectacle." Basil's voice, low and edged, answered, "Then perhaps the best way to stop it, Aunt, is to tell the inspector everything." "Everything," she snapped. "And what, pray, would that include?" He hesitated, and Miss Marple, who had been announced and stood quietly by the doorway, noted the flicker that crossed his face, a mixture of defiance and fear. Lady Caroline turned, recovering her composure at once. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. We were just discussing the arrangements for the inquest." "I hope I'm not intruding," said Miss Marple, taking the chair offered. "I merely came to bring a little comfort, and perhaps to ask a question or two, purely from curiosity." "Curiosity is a dangerous trait, Miss Marple," Lady Caroline said with a tight smile. "Indeed, but also a useful one," Miss Marple replied. "I was thinking of the garden party, such a beautiful occasion, yet so unfortunate in its ending. Tell me, who prepared the punch?" Lady Caroline frowned. "Mrs. Cornwall oversaw it, I believe." "Basil, didn't you fetch the wine from the cellar?" "Yes," Basil said, looking away. "And I opened one of the bottles myself. Denham insisted on using the red label, the more expensive brand. He said it would be a pity to serve anything less." "How thoughtful of him," Miss Marple murmured. "And afterward? Were the bottles cleared away?" Basil hesitated again. "Most of them. I left one near the orangery, I think." Lady Caroline's eyes flashed. "Then I trust it was disposed of properly. The inspector will think the worst if there's any confusion." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Confusion, my dear Lady Caroline, is precisely what murderers depend upon." That night, after the lamps were extinguished, Clara slipped from her room and crossed the landing. Her footsteps were soundless on the carpet, her face pale in the moonlight filtering through the window. She paused outside her mother's door, listening. No sound. Then she went on, descending the great staircase to the library. There, as she knelt before the hearth, drew back the screen, and reached beneath the grate. When her hand emerged, it held something small and glinting. A bottle, stoppered with cork and half filled with cloudy liquid. A soft voice spoke behind her. "You needn't hide it, my dear." Clara froze. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, shawl about her shoulders, expression kind yet implacable. "It's not what you think," Clara whispered. "I didn't poison him. I meant only to destroy it. He'd found out something dreadful." Miss Marple came closer, her tone gentle. "Then perhaps it's time you told someone what that was." Clara's hand trembled as she held the bottle out. It was about my mother. He discovered letters, old ones from years ago. He said he'd use them to force her into selling the estate. He wasn't the man we thought he was. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Blackmail, then? Yes, that explains a good deal, but you didn't kill him, did you? Clara shook her head, tears glinting. No, I swear it. I only found the bottle in his case afterward. I thought it might connect her, somehow. I couldn't bear for her to be accused. Miss Marple took the bottle carefully. Courage often comes disguised as foolishness, my dear, but sometimes destroying evidence only darkens the truth. From the hall came the faint creak of a board. Both women turned. A shadow shifted near the doorway, and for an instant the lamplight caught the gleam of eyes, cold, watchful, and far too alert. Then the sound of retreating steps echoed through the corridor, swift and deliberate. Miss Marple sighed softly. "Ah," she murmured, "it seems we have an audience, and I think, my dear, we've just frightened the real murderer." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The echo of those retreating footsteps faded through the hall, leaving Clara frozen where she knelt, her breath shallow and uneven. Miss Marple did not move for a moment. Her pale blue eyes remained fixed upon the darkened doorway. She had the composed stillness of someone who has already begun, quietly and without announcement, to think 3 steps ahead. "Close the shutters, my dear," she said softly, "and keep the lamp low. Whoever was listening may be uncertain how much we saw or heard. Uncertainty is a useful discomfort." Clara obeyed, her hands trembling as she fastened the window clasps. "Miss Marple, you don't think— Could it have been Basil?" "I think it could have been anyone who knew we were near the truth," she replied. "And your cousin does have the disconcerting habit of appearing when least wanted." Miss Marple set the bottle carefully upon the desk blotter, inspecting it beneath the dim light. "Strange, isn't it? How a little thing like this, so small, so unremarkable, can hold the key to a life's end. Tell me again, my dear. You found it in Mr. Denham's case?" "Yes," Clara whispered. "After the police left the study that night, I went to collect his papers for Lady Caroline. There were so many spread out on the desk. I thought if anyone saw this, they might think, well, that mother—" "I quite understand," said Miss Marple kindly. "But you see, the very fact that you hid it may have saved your mother rather than condemned her. Whoever was listening knows now that we possess it, and that will make them anxious. Anxiety leads to haste, and haste to error." There was the sound of a door closing somewhere above. Clara started violently. "It's only the wind, perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, though her eyes drifted to the ceiling. "Still, it would be unwise to stay here. Come, my dear, we'll put this in the inspector's keeping before breakfast. A sleepless night is often the best companion for truth." The next morning found the village buzzing again. More subdued this time, but with an undercurrent of speculation sharpened by gossip. Word of the inquest had spread, and even the baker, who prided himself on neutrality in all human affairs, offered 2 opinions before noon. Miss Marple arrived at the town hall early, quietly taking a seat near the back. The coroner's table gleamed under the gas lights, and the scent of damp wool and ink mingled faintly in the air. Inspector Harrow entered with his usual brisk composure, though his eyes sought Miss Marple at once and flicked briefly toward her bag. She gave a slight nod, confirmation that she had brought the bottle. He inclined his head in gratitude before taking his place. The proceedings began. Dr. Ferris was the first to speak, describing the medical facts with precision and unease. "Strychnine," he explained, acted swiftly. There was no doubt the poison had been ingested shortly before Mr. Denham's death. The jury listened with grave attention. Lady Caroline, veiled and impassive, sat beside her daughter. Basil Whitby lingered behind them, his expression faintly resentful, as though the entire affair were an inconvenience to his ambitions. When the inspector rose to question the household staff, Miss Marple observed closely. Mrs. Cornwall was firm, the model of domestic rectitude. Peter Latham nervous but sincere. Miss Evans tearful and eager to please. Only Basil's testimony seemed to carry a faint, discordant note. He spoke too easily, his voice practiced, his eyes avoiding Clara's. "I saw Denham shortly before he collapsed," he said. "He seemed ill-tempered. He accused me of meddling in his business with my aunt. I left him near the orangery, quite alive." "Did you notice what he drank?" the inspector asked. "Punch, of course. The same as everyone. I poured it myself. Miss Evans can confirm." Miss Evans nodded quickly from her seat. "Yes, I saw him." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for only a heartbeat. "The same as everyone," she repeated silently. That was rarely true. In her experience, poisoners depended upon the small peculiarities that separate one person's habits from another's. The sugar omitted, the fruit slice added, the preference for the second glass rather than the first. When the coroner finally called for adjournment, declaring that further investigation was required, the crowd dispersed into a drizzle of conversation and speculation. Miss Marple waited until the hall was nearly empty before approaching the inspector. "I believe this belongs to you," she said, placing the small bottle in his hand. "You'll find traces of strychnine within. It was hidden at the hall." Harrow frowned. "Hidden? By whom?" "By Miss Whitby," she answered calmly, "but not through guilt, through loyalty." His brow furrowed deeper. "You're sure of that?" "Quite. And I rather think our murderer already knows she no longer has it." He looked startled. "She? You mean you suspect—" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I never use pronouns prematurely, Inspector. But I will say this. We are dealing with someone accustomed to being believed and who counts upon that advantage. It narrows the field considerably, don't you think?" That evening, the quiet of St. Mildred's was deceptive. Within Rosewood Hall, tension had thickened to a palpable hum. Lady Caroline kept to her room, pleading fatigue. Basil was nowhere to be found. Clara lingered in the music room, fingers resting idly on the keys, her thoughts heavy with dread. When the door opened behind her, she turned swiftly, but it was only Miss Marple, serene as ever. "My dear," she said, "forgive the intrusion. I wish to tell you that I've given the bottle to the inspector. You needn't fear its discovery now." Clara's relief was genuine, but fleeting. "Then it's over." "Not quite," Miss Marple said gently. "It's nearly always darkest just before people begin to tell the truth." She looked around the room, noting the half-empty decanter on the sideboard. "May I?" she asked, pouring a small measure of brandy. "Ah, this scent. Polish, perhaps. The same peat mentioned by the lake. How odd that it should linger here." Clara stared at her. "This is my mother's favorite room. She insists everything shine." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Perfection requires constant polishing, and sometimes one polishes away rather inconvenient stains." Before Clara could answer, footsteps approached in the corridor. The door opened abruptly, and Lady Caroline entered, her expression composed but her eyes sharp. "Miss Marple?" she said, her tone polite yet brittle. "I had not expected callers this evening." "I do beg pardon," Miss Marple said with a smile that was all sweetness and no apology. "I was merely admiring your furniture. So many lovely surfaces, and all so very well kept." Lady Caroline's lips curved faintly. "Cleanliness is a virtue, Miss Marple." "Indeed," she replied softly. "And yet one wonders, when something is scrubbed too clean, what was meant to be erased?" For an instant, something flickered behind Lady Caroline's composure, a tightening of the mouth, a faint tremor at the edge of her voice when she replied, "I think you should go, Miss Marple. My daughter is tired." "As you wish," said Miss Marple, rising. "Rest well, my dear. I dare say tomorrow will bring clarity. It usually does when people begin to slip in their stories. She left the room quietly, her expression thoughtful. Outside, the night had settled in deep and still, but her mind was alive with quiet certainty. For all Lady Caroline's poise, the mask had cracked. There was polish on the brandy decanter, polish on the cuff of a dead man, and behind it all, the smell of fear disguised as gentility. And Miss Marple knew with the calm satisfaction of one who has seen such patterns before, that the next move would belong to the guilty. The following morning dawned pale and still, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. A mist hung low across the village, curling over hedgerows and seeping into the lanes like a ghost reluctant to leave. Miss Marple, rising earlier than usual, felt the peculiar clarity that often preceded the conclusion of a puzzle. She had not slept much. Her mind, busy with small details, had turned the night into one long conversation with memory and reason. By 8 o'clock, she was on her way to the hall. Inspector Harrow had sent word that he wished to examine the study where Mr. Denham had worked in his final hours. Miss Marple, whose curiosity was now officially sanctioned, accompanied him. The room smelled faintly of smoke and polish, the air still heavy with the scent of beeswax and old paper. Dust motes drifted lazily through a slant of morning light. On the desk lay Denham's briefcase, its contents neatly arranged by the inspector the night before. Letters, financial ledgers, and a stack of correspondence tied with blue ribbon. Neat fellow, wasn't he? Harrow said, pulling on his gloves, though he made enemies easily enough. These letters to Lady Caroline are blunt to the point of insolence. He wanted her to sell the South Meadow and pay her debts outright. Threatened exposure of some past irregularity if she refused. Miss Marple glanced at the stack. That must be the letters her daughter mentioned. It seems our unfortunate solicitor was not merely engaged to Miss Whitby, but also engaged in a rather dangerous game. Blackmail, Harrow said grimly. Plain as day. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, her voice thoughtful. But blackmailers, Inspector, tend to believe themselves cleverer than their prey. They seldom account for desperation. The inspector shot her a sidelong look. You think Lady Caroline killed him? I think, she said, examining the polish-stained decanter on the sideboard, that Lady Caroline is the sort of woman who regards scandal as worse than sin. If she thought exposure inevitable, she might prefer tragedy. Harrow made a note, though his brow furrowed. There's something that doesn't fit. Denham drank the poisoned punch near the orangery. If Lady Caroline intended to kill him, she'd have had to add the poison there, and she claims she never went near it. Miss Marple turned toward the window. No, she wouldn't have gone herself, but others might act out of loyalty or fear. And loyalty, when misplaced, is often the most dangerous motive of all. A soft knock interrupted them. Clara entered, pale but composed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Inspector, my mother wishes to see you in the morning room. She says it's urgent. Harrow exchanged a look with Miss Marple. Thank you, Miss Whitby. Tell her I'll be along directly. When Clara had gone, he muttered, If she's ready to confess, I'll eat my hat. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, I doubt she'll confess, Inspector. But I dare say she's realized the performance must continue, and like most actors, she fears the final act. In the morning room, Lady Caroline sat near the fire, a shawl draped elegantly over her shoulders. She looked fragile, but not broken, her poise immaculate. Basil stood beside her, restless, his fingers drumming on the mantelpiece. Inspector, she said in her cool, measured voice, I understand there are renewed suspicions surrounding my family. I cannot allow that. I wish to make a statement. Harrow took out his notebook. Go ahead, Lady Caroline. She lifted her chin. Mr. Denham's death was an accident. He was not well and he carried certain medicines. I believe he may have taken something in error. Any suggestion that my family was involved is cruel and baseless. Then how do you explain the strychnine found in his glass? Harrow asked evenly. Her gaze flickered, just a fraction too quickly. He brought that bottle himself, I saw it in his case." Miss Marple spoke gently. "Ah, but the bottle from his case contained only water when found, Lady Caroline. It had been rinsed thoroughly, with the same brand of polish used on your furniture." The room went very still. Basil's hand froze mid-tap. Lady Caroline's face whitened, her composure slipping for the first time. "Really, Miss Marple," she said at last, "I don't see what household polish has to do with anything." "Oh, everything, I'm afraid," said Miss Marple kindly. "You see, the scent of it was on Mr. Denham's cuff. He must have grasped something freshly polished, something perhaps offered to him with a smile." Basil stepped forward. "You're saying my aunt gave him the poisoned glass? That's absurd." "Not directly," Miss Marple replied. "But she may have prepared it, or thought she had. The Polish smell tells us the glass came from her tray, not the one by the orangery. Someone changed them, possibly without her knowing." The inspector frowned. "You mean there was a second hand involved?" "Quite possibly," said Miss Marple. "Blackmail seldom confines itself to one victim. If Lady Caroline was protecting her past, someone else may have been protecting their future." Lady Caroline's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she glanced at Basil, and in that fleeting look Miss Marple read all that was necessary: fear, guilt, and the silent understanding of complicity. Harrow caught it too. "Mr. Whitby, I'd like you to stay available for further questions. There's something here that doesn't sit right." Basil bristled. "I've told you everything I know." "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly, "and perhaps a little too quickly." After they left the hall, the inspector walked beside her down the misty drive. "You've unsettled them, Miss Marple." Basil looked ready to bolt. "That's precisely what I hoped," she said. "A guilty conscience rarely stays still for long. If he runs, we'll know why." True to her prediction, by evening word reached the village that Basil Whitby had taken the motor car and driven toward Kingsmere. Besides, Constable found him hours later at a roadside inn, pale and half drunk, demanding a train ticket to London. When brought back, his defiance crumbled under questioning. "Yes, I switched the glasses," he admitted bitterly. "But it wasn't murder. It was to frighten him. I only meant to make him ill, to teach him a lesson. He was ruining us, threatening Aunt Caroline with those letters, threatening to call off the engagement and expose everything. I used a little from that bottle I found in his bag. How was I to know it would kill him?" Miss Marple, present as a silent witness, shook her head sadly. "Intent is a slippery thing, Mr. Whitby. You played at justice without understanding its cost." When the confession was taken down, the inspector looked weary but satisfied. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "You saw what none of us did. The polish, the glass, the guilt." She folded her hands primly. "It was all quite simple, Inspector. People always leave a trace of themselves behind, especially when they've tried their hardest to appear spotless." Outside, the mist was lifting, revealing the pale shimmer of dawn over the fields. Miss Marple paused at the gate, breathing in the cold, clean air. "Poor Lady Caroline," she said softly. "All she ever wished for was to keep her name untarnished, but even the finest silver, Inspector, must be polished too often to hide the rust beneath." He gave a low whistle. "You make it sound almost poetic." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, not poetic, my dear man. Merely human." As they parted, the first sunlight broke through the thinning fog, glinting on the dewy grass like scattered pearls. And somewhere within Rosewood Hall, the echoes of whispered secrets faded into silence at last, leaving only the ordinary sounds of mourning, and Miss Marple, quietly content that justice, in its most delicate form, had been restored. The confession had the effect of settling the air in St. Mildred's for a moment, like a pond gone still after a thrown stone. Yet beneath that calm, tiny ripples of unease spread outward. The villagers were quick to accept the official version. Young Mr. Basil Whitby, rash and foolish, had tampered with a glass meant for warning, and instead brought about death. It satisfied the appetite for justice and allowed the world to resume its comfortable shape. But for Miss Marple, the surface was altogether too smooth. She could not rid herself of the feeling that the ripples were still moving somewhere in the depths. Inspector Harrow called upon her 2 days later, bringing the final reports from Kingsmere. "It's all quite straightforward," he said with a certain weariness. The bottle matched the residue in Denham's glass, and Basil's prints were on both. The coroner will call it manslaughter. Lady Caroline's name cleared, the estate intact, everyone happy. Well, nearly everyone. Miss Marple poured the tea and regarded him over the rim of her cup. "And you, Inspector, are you happy?" He hesitated, stirring his sugar, though he never took any. "To tell the truth, I'm not. There are small things that don't sit right. Basil swears he only meant to frighten Denham. Yet how did he know where the strychnine was kept, and who taught him enough to measure it so neatly?" "People learn odd things when they grow up in large houses," said Miss Marple gently. "But you are correct. Knowledge seldom appears by accident. Someone showed him, perhaps under the guise of helping." Harrow frowned. "You still think there's another hand in this?" "I think there is nearly always another hand," she replied. "Guilt is rarely solitary. It likes company." After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, listening to the faint hiss of the fire. Her mind wandered back to the conversation in the morning room, the polish, the decanter, the look that had passed between aunt and nephew. Basil's fear had been genuine, yes, but there had been a curious absence of surprise when confronted, as though he had known all along that his confession would suit someone else better than the truth. That afternoon she walked to Rosewood Hall once more, under the pretext of returning a book Lady Caroline had lent her years ago, and almost certainly forgotten. The door was answered by Mrs. Cornwall, whose manner had grown notably restrained since the scandal. "Her ladyship is resting," the housekeeper said, her lips tight. "Then perhaps I might wait in the garden," Miss Marple replied mildly. "The roses are so very fine this year." The housekeeper hesitated, then nodded. "If you wish, ma'am, but best stay near the terrace. The gardeners are trimming by the lake." Miss Marple wandered along the gravel path, noting with quiet satisfaction that the scent of polish lingered less than before. She paused by the yew hedge, the same hedge that had framed the dreadful scene that day. A robin darted out, indifferent to human tragedy. Her gaze dropped to the gravel, where small white fragments glimmered faintly against the damp earth. She bent down and picked one up. A chip of porcelain, delicately curved, the edge gilded. It might once have been part of a miniature cup or a decorative saucer. Strange that it should lie here still, overlooked after so many searches. A voice behind her made her start. "Still looking for clues, Miss Marple?" She turned to find Dr. Ferris watching her, hat in hand. His expression was polite, but there was a glint behind it, something watchful. "Oh, dear me, no," she said pleasantly. "I'm much too old for such excitements. Only admiring the garden." He smiled thinly. "A tragic business, but at least it's ended. Lady Caroline will recover, I think, given time. She's asked me to advise rest and calm." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Calm is so restorative, unless, of course, one has too much of it. Then the mind begins to wander." He looked at her curiously. "You have a way of saying things, Miss Marple. Almost makes one uneasy." "Does it?" she said, meeting his gaze with gentle interest. "Perhaps because I've seen so many cases where illness concealed intent. When one treats people long enough, one learns their secrets." A flicker crossed his face. So brief most would have missed it, but not she. "You imply something rather serious." "Oh, no," she said softly. "Merely that Mr. Denham trusted his physician more than anyone. He took that London tonic, you recall. The same that turned out not to be so harmless after all. I wonder, did you ever test it yourself?" He stiffened. "You're imagining things." "Possibly," she agreed, tucking the porcelain fragment into her glove. But imagination, like poison, can be quite potent in small doses. She left him standing by the hedge, his expression dark. That evening, she sent a discreet note to Inspector Harrow asking whether the laboratory had tested the original contents of Mr. Denham's bottle before concluding their report. The reply came the next morning. No residue found. Bottle rinsed thoroughly prior to arrival. Rinsed thoroughly. Miss Marple sat back, the phrase echoing in her mind. The bottle had been in Basil's possession only briefly. He would hardly have thought to rinse it so carefully. But a man trained in medicine, with a chemist's precision and a physician's access. Yes, he would. 2 nights later, another incident shook St. Mildred's. Dr. Ferris was found collapsed in his surgery, a small overturned vial beside him. The label read, "Sedative mixture." The coroner ruled it accidental overdose. The village, hungry for closure, accepted it at once. Only Miss Marple, attending the brief service, noticed that Lydia Ferris's veil trembled not with grief, but with a kind of release. Afterward, the inspector approached her quietly. "I suppose this ends it," he said. "He must have been involved after all." Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave. "Yes, poor man. I believe he saw the noose tightening and preferred a quieter exit. He supplied Denham with the strychnine, perhaps to strengthen his tonic, then discovered too late that his patient was using it for blackmail. Basil became his pawn, and when Denham died, Ferris thought he could still control the story, but one can never quite predict how guilt behaves, can one?" Harrow looked thoughtful. "You think the wife knew?" "She suspected," said Miss Marple. "Wives usually do. But she'll keep her silence. She has already paid dearly enough in fare." The inspector gave a slow nod. "I'll file it as accidental. Sometimes truth does more harm than good." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Quite so, Inspector. Justice, you see, is not always about punishment. Sometimes it is simply about understanding where pity should begin." As she walked home through the quiet dusk, the lamps flickering to life in cottage windows, she reflected on the curious symmetry of it all. Death had begun at Rosewood Hall with pride and ended in the doctor's surgery with shame. 2 halves of the same story, bound by secrecy and fear. Yet St. Mildred's would go on, as villages always did, mending its gossip with time and tea. Miss Marple paused at her gate, the night air cool against her face. She looked up at the stars, faint but steady, and smiled to herself. Human nature, she thought, was endlessly inventive, capable of wickedness, folly, and unexpected grace. And though the village slept content once more, she knew that somewhere, in another quiet corner of England, another shadow would fall, another small deceit would grow into tragedy. But that, she mused, was life, and for those who observed it closely enough, its mysteries never truly ended. The morning after Dr. Ferris's death, a heavy quiet settled over St. Mildred's, a quiet that was less peace than exhaustion. The tragedy at Rosewood Hall had drained the village of conversation. Even Mrs. Potts at the post office spoke in subdued tones, as if words themselves might stir old ghosts. For all that, Miss Marple sensed that something still lingered unsaid. People were behaving as they always did after the appearance of resolution, pretending life had resumed its familiar shape while secretly glancing over their shoulders to be sure it had. She spent the morning pruning the climbing roses at her cottage, though her hands moved more slowly than usual. Her mind, methodical as ever, retraced the chain of events. Basil's confession had explained how the poison reached the glass, and Ferris's death confirmed a deeper guilt, but not why. The true motive still felt slightly out of tune, like a single wrong note in an otherwise harmonious melody. It was that wrong note that troubled her now. At 11, Inspector Harrow called again. He looked weary, as men often did after tidy conclusions that refused to stay tidy. "I've closed the Ferris file," he said. standing awkwardly by her garden gate. "Officially, it's accidental overdose. But between you and me, I think you were right. He couldn't face the inquiry." Miss Marple gave him a sympathetic smile. "Conscience can be a cruel companion, Inspector. It speaks loudest when one is alone." He nodded, but did not leave. "There's one detail that keeps nagging me," he admitted. "Dr. Ferris kept meticulous records, ledgers for every prescription, every patient. But the page for Denham's last visit is torn clean out. Mrs. Ferris says she never saw it. I thought it was just shame, but—" He hesitated. "Do you ever have the feeling a story ends too conveniently?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked thoughtfully. "Constantly," she said. "Convenience is rarely natural, Inspector. It's usually arranged." That afternoon she put on her hat and coat and walked toward the doctor's house. The surgery door stood slightly ajar, as though waiting for patients who would never come. Lydia Ferris answered her knock, pale but composed, her eyes hollow from too little sleep. "Miss Marple," she said, managing a faint smile, "you've come to offer condolences." "Indeed, my dear, and perhaps to ease a conscience, if one exists to be eased." Lydia hesitated. "You mean mine?" "I mean anyone's who suffers for silence," Miss Marple replied gently. "Won't you let me in?" They sat together in the small parlor, where the smell of disinfectant clung to the air like a memory. Lydia's hands twisted in her lap. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she said suddenly, her composure cracking. "George wasn't wicked. He was foolish, proud. Denham tricked him." "Go on, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "Denham found out about a patient," Lydia whispered. "A woman from the hall, Lady Caroline. Years ago, before Clara was born, she came to George in secret. There was a matter of reputation. He treated her discreetly, kept no record. Denham discovered it somehow. He threatened exposure unless George helped him procure strychnine for his so-called tonic. George thought if he cooperated, it would end there. But Denham kept pressing. Then came the engagement to Clara, another hold over the family. It was unbearable." Miss Marple listened without interruption. "And so, when Basil found the poison, he thought it belonged to Denham, but it did not." Lydia shook her head miserably. "No, it came from our surgery cupboard. George replaced it with quinine, hoping to avoid suspicion if ever checked. After Denham's death, he tried to retrieve the empty bottle from the hall, but Lady Caroline saw him. She knew. She told him quietly that she would protect him if he remained silent. But silence is not peace, Miss Marple. It's only waiting." The older woman reached across and took her hand. "You've carried a heavy burden, my dear. It's not my place to judge what's already punished itself. But tell me, did your husband truly intend to end his life?" Lydia's tears came then, swift and soundless. "Yes, he said it was the only way to stop the whispers. I begged him not to, but he left a note for the inspector, tore it up before I could stop him." "Did you keep the pieces?" A pause. Then Lydia rose, crossed to a writing desk, and opened the drawer. From beneath a folded handkerchief, she drew a small envelope containing scraps of paper, the writing faint but legible. Miss Marple pieced them together on the table, her eyes narrowing as the words took shape. Not Basil's fault, she knew before, could not bear, better to be silent forever. Miss Marple folded the fragments carefully. "You should give this to Inspector Harrow. It will close the circle properly. Not all confessions belong in court, but truth should find a resting place somewhere." Lydia nodded, exhausted. "Will you tell Lady Caroline?" "I think not," Miss Marple said quietly. "She's had her punishment too. The past rarely stays buried, but she has built her life upon forgetting. Let her continue, if she can." That evening Miss Marple walked home through the fading light. The village lamps had begun to glow one by one, soft halos in the mist. She stopped by the churchyard gate, looking toward Rosewood Hall. It stood serene again, its windows lit like amber eyes, watchful but no longer menacing. Inside, Clara was playing the piano, a slow, mournful tune that drifted faintly down the hill. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Music, she thought, was the only confession that required no words. The following morning, Inspector Harrow came by with gratitude in his eyes and weariness in his voice. "Mrs. Ferris gave me the note," he said. "It clears Basil of intent, though the coroner's verdict will stand as it is. I've spoken with Lady Caroline. She's leaving for London, perhaps permanently. The hall will be let." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. Sometimes places absorb too much of what has happened in them. They need new voices, new life." He looked at her thoughtfully. "You never stop, do you? Even after a case ends?" She smiled. "One doesn't stop seeing, Inspector. Once you've learned to observe, you cannot unlearn it. The patterns of human nature repeat. Different faces, same hearts, and that, in its way, is a comfort." He tipped his hat and departed. When the sound of his footsteps had faded, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire. The day's last light fell through the window, glinting off her knitting needles. She resumed her work, the soft click of the yarn steady and unhurried. On the table beside her lay the small porcelain fragment she had found by the lake, a reminder of all that was broken and all that, somehow, still fitted together. Outside, the bells of St. Mildred's began to ring for evening prayers, and their echoes mingled with the gentle creak of the cottage walls. Miss Marple listened, her thoughts peaceful at last. The village would heal, as villages always did. The living would gossip, the dead would rest, and time would wrap its quiet arm around them all. She smiled faintly, her eyes on the glowing hearth. Another shadow had passed, leaving behind the familiar, enduring light of human frailty, and the certainty that, wherever there was keenness and curiosity enough to see it, the truth would always, eventually, come out. A week passed, and St. Mildred's, ever adaptable, began to fold its sorrow neatly away like an old shawl kept for rainy days. Life resumed its slow rhythm, the church bell marking the hours, the baker's cart trundling through the square, and the postmistress's gossip softening into the safer territory of recipes and parish news. To a stranger, it would have seemed as though nothing extraordinary had ever occurred. But Miss Marple, whose eyes saw far, more than they were supposed to, felt the faint tremor of unease that still rippled beneath the calm surface. Some stories, she knew, did not end merely because people stopped talking about them. It was on a soft autumn afternoon that she received an unexpected visitor. Clara Whitby stood hesitating at the garden gate, a figure of pale composure wrapped in a dark traveling cloak. Her face, though young, carried the fragile strain of someone who had watched too much fall apart too quickly. Miss Marple, looking up from her rose bushes, smiled gently. "My dear Miss Whitby," she said, setting down her trowel, "you look as though the wind has brought you from far away." "Only from the hall," Clara answered with a faint smile. "We leave for London tomorrow. Mother insists we must begin afresh." She paused. "I wanted to thank you, before we go, for everything." Miss Marple brushed her gloves clean. "I did very little, my dear. The truth, once disturbed, has a habit of finding its own path. I merely cleared away some of the undergrowth." Clara stepped closer, her hands twisting the clasp of her handbag. "You may call it little, but it saved us. Still, there's something that troubles me. About Basil." Miss Marple gestured toward the garden seat. "Sit down, my dear. You'll feel easier if you tell me." Clara sat, her gaze lowered. "He's gone back to London as well. He says he wants to forget everything, but I think he's afraid. He told me something before he left, something that doesn't make sense. He said he found another letter in Mr. Denham's papers, one addressed to him, postmarked the day before the party. He burned it, he said, but he looked so frightened." Miss Marple's fingers tightened ever so slightly around her teacup. A letter? How very interesting. Did he say what it contained? Only that Denham warned him to be careful whom he trusted, and that some secrets in the family were not as buried as we like to think. Clara's voice trembled. He swore he didn't know what it meant, but I think it frightened him more than the thought of prison. Said Miss Marple softly. A posthumous warning. How very like human nature. The dead do have a knack for leaving their work unfinished. For a moment they sat in silence, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves along the fence. Then Clara rose. I must go. Mother's waiting and there's packing to be done. I wanted to say goodbye properly. St. Mildred's feels smaller now, as though something has gone out of it. Ah, but that's the way of all places touched by tragedy, Miss Marple said. They shrink a little, just for a time, but they grow again, like gardens after a storm. You must let them. Clara smiled faintly, but there was no light in it. Goodbye, Miss Marple. I hope someday I can think of Rosewood without feeling cold. When she was gone, Miss Marple stood for a long while at her gate, watching the lane wind away toward the hall. The sun dipped low, turning the air the color of old gold. A letter, she thought, and a warning. It was curious that a man clever enough to blackmail others should have felt the need to warn Basil. It hinted at something unresolved, a loose thread left dangling. That evening, as the lamps were lit, Inspector Harrow called again. He looked less burdened now, though his expression, as always, betrayed curiosity. I've just come from Kingsmere, he told her. Ferris's affairs are in order, but there's one oddity. His bank records show a series of payments from an anonymous source over several months. Not large amounts, but steady. The first was just after Denham came to St. Mildred's. Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. How convenient that people are so bad at hiding their motives behind money. The anonymous source, of course, wasn't anonymous to him. You think Denham was paying Ferris? Oh, no, she said. Quite the reverse. I think Ferris was paying him. For silence. That's why Denham's leverage was so effective. He had proof that Ferris falsified prescriptions for Lady Caroline's delicate situation years ago. Those payments were the price of continued peace. Harrow exhaled. Then Ferris killed him to end the blackmail, used Basil as the unwitting tool. Exactly. But I fear that wasn't quite the end. I suspect Denham's letter to Basil hinted at another truth still buried. Something older. Something Lady Caroline would never have allowed to surface. The inspector frowned. You mean Clara's parentage? Miss Marple gave him a small, sad smile. Ah, Inspector, how quickly you see it once it's said aloud. Yes, that was the shadow Denham held over them all. The child born after a quiet scandal, protected by Ferris's discretion. It explains Lady Caroline's desperation, Basil's misplaced loyalty, and Denham's arrogance. Secrets, once bought, have a way of growing dearer than truth itself. Harrow looked down at his notebook, though he did not write. Should we tell the girl? No, Miss Marple said gently. Let her have her peace. What's past is no longer dangerous unless someone digs it up again, and Basil will not. He has learned that some knowledge weighs too heavily for comfort. The inspector studied her a moment longer. You have a way of finding the edges of things, Miss Marple. I sometimes wonder what would happen if you hadn't. She smiled, her eyes soft with amusement. I imagine the world would muddle along much as it always has, Inspector, just with a little more confusion. When he had gone, she settled once more by her fire. Outside, the village lay calm beneath the stars, the chimneys breathing faint trails of smoke into the chill air. She thought of Clara in London, of Lady Caroline retreating into her proud silence, of Basil, haunted but alive. Justice, she reflected, was rarely perfect. It came in pieces, some found, some lost, some better left unclaimed. The kettle whistled softly, and she poured herself another cup of tea. As the clock ticked on, she opened her notebook and wrote the last line beneath the neat list of names and events. Peace restored, though imperfectly. Human nature, constant as ever. She closed the book, set down her pen, and gazed into the fire. The flames danced and hissed, burning clean and bright, like memory purified of its pain. Outside, a night bird called from the hedgerow, and the sound seemed almost like laughter, the quiet, knowing kind that Miss Marple so often shared with the world. In the end, Rosewood Hall would stand again in sunshine, its shutters repainted, its gardens renewed. The villagers would forget, as villagers must, until the next whisper of intrigue drifted through the lanes. But Miss Marple would remember. Not the crime itself, but the delicate pattern of it, the way small deceits intertwined with love and fear to make something tragically human. And so the shadow that had lingered over Rosewood Hall lifted at last, leaving only the faint scent of roses and the calm assurance that, in every corner of life, truth would wait patiently for someone observant enough to notice it. The days shortened as autumn deepened, the fields around St. Mildred's turning bronze and quiet beneath the drifting mist. The scandal of Rosewood Hall had begun to fade, as all things do in villages that prize routine above memory. Yet to Miss Marple, whose mind never left a question comfortably unanswered, there remained one final loose thread, a faint but persistent itch of intuition that told her the story was not entirely complete. It was a Sunday afternoon, the sort that made even the church bells sound drowsy, when the postman brought her a small, thick envelope from London. The handwriting was careful, youthful, and unmistakably anxious. She read it at once, then folded it thoughtfully, her eyes softening. The letter was from Clara. Dear Miss Marple, I do not know whether you will think me foolish to write, but I cannot rest. I found among Mother's papers a note, old, brittle, unsigned. It says only, "He must never know." I think it was meant for Dr. Ferris. I have tried to forget, but it troubles me still. Was there something more behind all this? Something we are not to speak of? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her fingers resting on the page. Poor child, she murmured, still reaching for the edges of the truth. She sat very still for a long time, the letter open before her, until the kettle began to sing from the hearth. Then, as if reaching a quiet decision, she rose and went to her writing desk. Her reply was brief. My dear Miss Whitby, there are always things better left to rest, particularly those written in haste by frightened people. You must not let the shadows of others' mistakes linger over your own life. It is the living who deserve peace, not the dead. Remember that your courage and kindness are your own. They are not inherited, but chosen, and that is all that matters. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. She sealed it carefully and placed it by the door for posting. Then she returned to her chair by the window, where the view of the village spread before her in its comforting, ordinary beauty. Chimney smoke curling upward, children playing near the vicarage, and the faint gleam of the church's stained glass catching the afternoon sun. Her thoughts turned briefly to Lady Caroline, now living quietly in a small London flat. Rumour had it she rarely received visitors. Miss Marple doubted she was lonely. Guilt, after all, was the most faithful of companions. As for Basil, he had gone abroad, the newspapers said, to recover his health. Clara, thankfully, had begun some small work with a charity and was said to smile again, and Dr. Ferris's widow had left St. Mildred's altogether, taking a modest position in Bath. In their several ways, the players of the tragedy had found their endings, some peaceful, others penitent, but all in keeping with the curious justice of life. Miss Marple herself found comfort in the simple acts of routine, the pruning of her roses, the arrangement of her tea things, the weekly visits to the churchyard. Yet when she passed the Weatherby plot, she sometimes thought of Harold Denham and the chain of small human failings that had led to his death. pride, fear, shame. Each a little thing, until together they formed a weapon sharper than any knife. Human nature, she mused, was not wicked so much as weary, always trying to preserve what should have been surrendered long ago. One evening, as she sat with the vicar and his wife over supper, they spoke as people in villages do of the curious events of the past year. "It was dreadful," Mrs. Weatherby said, shaking her head, "and yet I can't help thinking how fortunate we are to have such peace now. You must be relieved, Miss Marple, that the matter is so neatly concluded." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling over the rim of her teacup. "Neatly, yes, but never entirely. These things never are. People think of murder as something separate, dramatic, but it grows quite naturally from the soil of life, like weeds in a tidy garden. One simply learns to notice them early, before they spread too far." The vicar laughed softly. "You make it sound so ordinary." "My dear," said Miss Marple, "it is entirely ordinary. The motives that lead to murder are the same that make us gossip or envy or fib a little to save face. Only the circumstances change." She smiled again, serene. "That's why one must never stop watching and never stop forgiving either." Outside, the evening light had dimmed to violet. The vicar's cat stretched lazily by the fire. Miss Marple, rising to leave, fastened her shawl and stepped out into the cool air. The village lay wrapped in the gentle hush of twilight, its chimneys smoking contentedly, its windows glowing like little hearths of contentment. As she walked home, her cane tapping softly on the cobbles, she felt the familiar, quiet satisfaction that came with understanding the pattern beneath the surface of things. Life, like her knitting, was full of knots and tangles, but with patience and attention, one could always find where the thread began. At her cottage door she paused, looking up at the first star glimmering above the dark outline of Rosewood Hill. "Ah," she said softly to herself, "there it is again, the light after the shadow." She went inside, drew her curtains, and sat once more by her fire. The flames leapt and murmured, their warmth filling the room. On the small table beside her lay her knitting, the porcelain fragment she had once found by the lake, and Clara's letter, now folded neatly and tied with a bit of blue ribbon. Miss Marple picked up her needles and began to knit, her expression serene, her eyes thoughtful. Outside, the night deepened, the world turning quietly on its axis. And within the stillness of St. Mildred's, where secrets had been laid to rest and peace restored, she thought, as she always did at the close of such affairs, that humanity, for all its frailty, was endlessly worth the trouble of understanding. The fire crackled softly, the clock ticked on, and Miss Marple smiled to herself, gentle, wise, and utterly at peace, as another mystery passed into memory.